January of 897, Pope Stephen VI ordered his guards to dig up a corpse, not for reburial, but for trial. This is the story of the Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod. It's not a metaphor, and it's not a myth. It's the day the Catholic Church, in a formal council at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, placed a rotting body on a throne and screamed at it. It is one of the most grotesque events in human history, but it is more than just a macabre spectacle. It's a key. It's the moment that reveals a pattern of power, politics, and brutal suppression that the Vatican has used to protect itself for over 1,000 years. Tonight, we unlock 6 of the Vatican's darkest secrets, from a political trial of the dead to a modern conspiracy of the living, from a $1.4 billion bank collapse linked to the mafia to a divine prophecy so terrifying the Pope himself ordered it buried. These are the files the Vatican never wanted opened. The man on trial was Pope Formosus. He had been pope from 891 to 896 AD, and by all accounts had a controversial career. But his true crime, it seems, was dying. The man on the prosecution was Pope Stephen VI. He was the successor of Formosus' successor, and he harbored a deep political hatred for the dead man. In January 897, about 7 to 9 months after Formosus had been buried in his full papal vestments, Stephen ordered him dug up. The putrefied corpse, already in an advanced state of decomposition, was hauled from its crypt and dragged to the Basilica of St. John Lateran. This was not an act of spontaneous madness. It was a calculated political move. The late 9th and 10th centuries were a time of endemic political instability. The papacy was not a holy office. It was a revolving door of violent, aristocratic factions fighting for control. Between 872 and 965 AD, a total of 24 different popes ruled. Popes had the power to crown the Holy Roman Emperor, plunging them into a high-stakes game of intrigue where their life was on the line. Stephen's own successor, Romanus, would last just 92 days. Romanus' successor, Theodore II, would last less than 3 weeks. This synod was Stephen VI's brutal attempt to consolidate power and erase his enemies, dead or alive. The macabre spectacle began. The rotting cadaver of Formosus was dressed in the sacred papal robes he had worn in life. He was propped up on a throne to face his accuser. Of course, the defendant was in no condition to speak, so Pope Stephen VI assigned a young, terrified deacon to act as defense counsel. This novice was forced to stand behind the corpse and speak for the dead pope. Answering the charges as Pope Stephen, in a rage, he shouted at the body. Contemporary accounts describe the deacon cowering behind his dead client, stammering a weak defense as the Pope hurled abuse at the silent, decomposing figure. The charges were read. There were 3. First, that Formosus had committed perjury, relating to an oath he supposedly swore at a council years earlier. Second, that he had illegally presided over more than one diocese at the same time, a violation of canon law. And third, and most importantly, that he had ascended to the papacy illegally and usurped the universal Roman see. But these charges were merely a legalistic pretext. The real targets of the trial were not the dead, but the living. The trial's outcome was predetermined. The true goal was to retroactively declare Formosus' entire papacy null. By finding Formosus guilty, Stephen VI could declare all of his predecessors' acts and ordinations to be null and void. This was a political purge. Every bishop and priest Formosus had ordained, his allies, his political appointments, were suddenly commanded to be reordained, their power and clerical legitimacy instantly erased. As Stephen screamed at the corpse, the drama of the macabre scene was heightened by a sudden, violent omen. An earthquake shook the basilica, a sign many in the stunned audience took as divine judgment. It didn't matter. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. The punishment was as symbolic as it was horrific. The papal vestments which had been placed on the corpse for the trial were removed, stripping him of his office in death. Then, guards seized the body's right hand. They chopped off the 3 fingers Formosus had used to administer blessings. This was the clear message, a final physical act denouncing Formosus' entire papacy and erasing his influence from the Church's history. His body, now mutilated, was dragged through the streets of Rome and, in the ultimate desecration, thrown into the Tiber River. The message was clear. This is what happens to enemies of the papacy. But the plan backfired in a spectacular way. The macabre spectacle turned public opinion in Rome against Stephen. A fisherman later plucked Formosus' body from the Tiber. Rumors began to circulate that the recovered corpse was performing miracles. This turmoil exploded into riots on the streets. Just months later, the public and rival factions had their revenge. Pope Stephen VI was imprisoned and ultimately strangled to death in his cell. The chaos only escalated. The next pope, Theodore II, who reigned for just 20 days, had Formosus' body recovered and reburied with dignity in St. Peter's Basilica. His successor, Pope John IX, held 2 synods in 898 AD that formally condemned the Cadaver Synod and banned future trials of the dead. But then, just a few years later, Pope Sergius III nullified John IX's synod. The real lasting damage wasn't the desecration. It was the confusing spectacle of popes' infallibility contradicting popes. He reinstated the judgments against Formosus. This one bizarre event in 897 created a permanent, exploitable flaw in the Church's narrative of divine authority. To this day, anti-infallibilists and Church critics point to the Formosus case as a contradiction of the doctrine of papal infallibility. Some argue that the nullification of Formosus' ordinations, even if temporary, has resulted in the interruption of apostolic succession, throwing the entire validity of the Catholic priesthood into doubt. The Cadaver Synod was a political act of suppression so brutal it left a scar on Church doctrine that has never fully healed. And this wasn't the last time a pope's body would be desecrated, though the next time it wasn't a pope, but the man known as God's banker. The time is June of 1982. The setting is London, Italy's biggest private bank, Banco Ambrosiano, has just imploded, triggering a global financial crisis. And its chairman, Roberto Calvi, is missing. Calvi was known by another name, Banchier di Dio, God's banker. He earned the title because of his close ties to the Vatican and its own bank, the Istituto per le Opere de Religione, or IOR. The scandal began when a special audit at Banco Ambrosiano uncovered a black hole, $1.4 billion in questionable loans. Estimates of the missing money range from $1.2 to $1.6 billion. The money had been funneled to paper corporations based in Panama and Latin America. These were dummy corporations controlled by Calvi, but they had a powerful and supposedly holy partner. The Vatican Bank and its American-born president, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, was not a passive observer. It was an active enabler. Marcinkus was at the very center of the scandal. The paper corporations that received the $1.4 billion were in fact owned by the Vatican Bank. Marcinkus himself had provided Calvi with letters of patronage. These letters were essentially a type of guarantee from the Vatican, providing cover for Calvi's overseas operations. Calvi was using the Vatican's sovereign status and moral reputation as a shield to commit massive fraud. When the bank collapsed, creditors and the Italian government argued the Vatican had a moral responsibility to honor the entire debt. The Vatican Bank was exposed. Roberto Calvi knew where all the bodies and all the money were buried. And then he was found. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a body was discovered. 62-year-old Roberto Calvi was found hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge in London. The scene was chilling. It had bricks and lumps of concrete recovered from the pockets of his jacket and trousers. He also had over 10,000 pounds in cash on him. The first coroner's inquest recorded a verdict of Calvi's family was outraged. They insisted he was a devout Catholic and would not have taken his own life. They hired investigators. A second inquest a year later recorded an open verdict. But in the decades since, popular suspicion and forensic reinvestigation have led to a different conclusion. It was judged to be a murder. This was not just a murder. It was a ritualistic execution intended to send a very specific, terrifying message. A CIA document on the case noted the murder bore the hallmarks of a ritual killing. The location was the key. Calvi was found under the Blackfriars Bridge. One of his key partners in the scandal was an illegal, sinister Masonic P2 lodge. And what did the P2 Masons interestingly refer to themselves as? A fraternary, the Blackfriars. This was never just a bank scandal. It was the sudden, violent implosion of a shadow government. Calvi and the Vatican Bank were not acting alone. First, the Mafia. Calvi was accused of stealing millions that he was laundering on behalf of the Mafia. A Sicilian godfather turned informant, Francesco Franchi the Strangler Di Carlo, was even accused of being Calvi's killer. Second, Propaganda Due, or P2. This was a secret organization described as a state within a state. When its membership list was discovered, it was found to include government ministers, retired generals, top bankers, and members of the Italian Secret Service. The unmasking of P2 was such a profound shock, it led to the collapse of the Forlani government in Italy. This was the nexus. The Vatican Bank provided the cover. Calvi moved the money. The Mafia provided the muscle, and P2 provided the political and intelligence protection. It was the perfect, unaccountable system. Until Calvi lost $1.4 billion of their money. The Mafia informant Di Carlo later claimed that the real killers will never be brought to justice. Why? Because they are being protected by the Italian state, by members of the P2 Masonic Lodge. He described them as a mixture of politicians, bank presidents, the military, top security, and so on. And what about the man at the center of it all? The one who signed the letters of patronage and gave Calvi his holy cover? Archbishop Paul Marcinkus was indicted in 1982 by Italian prosecutors for his role in the fraud. But the charges never stuck. An Italian court ruled that Marcinkus and his Vatican Bank executives were immune from prosecution. The reason? They were Vatican employees and citizens of the Vatican. The Vatican, operating as a sovereign nation, simply refused to hand him over. The church never admitted legal responsibility for the $1.4 billion black hole. In 1984, it voluntarily paid $224 million to creditors, a token payment in recognition of its moral role, a financial settlement to make the problem disappear. Archbishop Marcinkus, God's banker, was never made a cardinal. He simply retired, safe from extradition, to a house by a golf course in Sun City, Arizona, where he died in 2006. This case established the modern Vatican shield, the use of sovereign statehood and diplomatic immunity as a legal fortress to place its officials above secular law. And this wasn't the first time the Vatican protected its own. On May 13, 1917, in the small town of Fatima, Portugal, 3 young shepherd children, Lucia dos Santos and her cousins Francisco and Jacinto Marto, claimed to have seen an apparition. The lady dressed in white, who identified herself as the Lady of the Rosary, appeared to them 6 times. She entrusted them with 3 secrets. Lucia, who would later become a Carmelite nun and live until 2005, wrote down the secrets in her memoirs. The Vatican, in a 2000 document, would call Fatima undoubtedly the most prophetic of modern apparitions. The first 2 secrets were revealed by Lucia in 1941. The first secret was a frightening vision of hell, a sea of fire filled with tormented souls and demons that looked like frightful and unknown animals. The second secret was a prophecy. The lady predicted the end of World War I, but warned that a worse war would begin, World War II, if people did not stop offending God. It also contained a specific dire warning about Russia, a prediction of the immense damage that Russia would do to humanity by abandoning the Christian faith and embracing communist totalitarianism, spreading her errors throughout the world. But there was a third secret. On January 3rd, 1944, at the order of her bishop, Sister Lucia wrote down the third secret. She sealed it in an envelope, noting it was not to be opened until 1960, by which time, she said, it will appear clearer. In 1957, the sealed envelope was transferred to the Vatican. In 1959, Pope John XXIII broke the seal and read the secret. The world anxiously awaited the 1960 revelation. It never came. Instead, the Vatican issued an anonymous press release stating that the secret would not be disclosed and would probably remain forever under absolute seal. Pope John decided to return the sealed envelope to the Holy Office and not to reveal its contents. One report claims he found the message not to his liking and decided to bury the message. This act of suppression, the Vatican's public decision to disobey the Virgin's alleged 1960 deadline, is the origin of one of the 20th century's greatest conspiracy theories. The information vacuum was immediately filled with fear. What could be so traumatic and dire that the Pope himself was afraid to reveal it? The world would have to wait another 40 years to find out. On May 13, 2000, Pope John Paul II, while visiting Fatima, announced the secret would finally be released. The following month, the Vatican published the full text. It was not a written prophecy, it was a symbolic vision. Sister Lucia's text, written in 1944, described an angel with a flaming sword in his left hand, flashing and giving out flames that looked as though they would set the world on fire. The angel cried out in a loud voice, "Penance, penance, penance." The children then saw a bishop dressed in white, who they had the impression was the Holy Father. He passed through a big city half in ruins and half trembling, afflicted with pain and sorrow, praying for the souls of the corpses he met on his way. When he reached a mountain, he was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. After him, other bishops, priests, and religious men and women were killed, one after another. The Vatican's official interpretation, presented by Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, was that the secret was not a literal prophecy of the future. Instead, it was a symbolic vision of the 20th century suffering, the Church's great struggle against communist totalitarianism. And the bishop dressed in white? The Vatican decisively linked this to the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, which occurred on May 13, 1981, the anniversary of the first Fatima apparition. John Paul II, who read the secret while recovering, became convinced of its meaning. He consistently attributed his survival to the intercession of Our Lady of Fatima. It was a mother's hand, he said, that guided the bullet's path. For the Vatican, the case was closed. The prophecy had been fulfilled. For critics, the real cover-up had just begun. The 2000 release was probably disappointing or surprising after all the speculation it had stirred. No great mystery is revealed, nor is the future unveiled. This disappointment quickly hardened into suspicion. Critics, known as Fatimists, immediately claimed the text was not the real secret, or at least not the full secret. The central theory is that there are two texts. The Vatican, they claim, released the 4-page vision but suppressed a single-page letter that contained the words of the Virgin Mary, the explanation of the vision. And what does this alleged missing text contain? The theories are apocalyptic. Some say it's a warning of a nuclear holocaust. But the most persistent theory is that it prophesied a great apostasy, a diabolical disorientation inside of the Catholic Church. This theory claims the true secret was a warning that Satan will introduce himself even to the highest summit of the Church. Some die-hard Fatimists believe the prophecy warned that the changes of the Second Vatican Council were in fact the beginning of this great apostasy, and that church leaders refuse to acknowledge it. The conspiracy's power lies in a simple, logical mismatch. Why would Pope John XXIII and Pope Paul VI bury a secret for 40 years, defying a direct order from the Virgin Mary, if it was just a symbolic vision of a 1981 assassination attempt on a future pope? The 40-year suppression seems vastly disproportionate to the text that was released. Critics argue the traumatic and dire secret must be about something the Vatican still wants to hide, a prophecy not of its persecution but of its own corruption. But some believe the real secret is still locked away. To the modern world, exorcism is the stuff of Hollywood fantasy. But to the Vatican, it's not a fantasy, it is a ministry of charity. And like any ministry, it is also a bureaucracy. In 1614, Pope Paul V promulgated the Ritual Romanum, or Roman ritual. This guidebook for priests, used for centuries, is a magnificent distillation of the accumulated wisdom and experience of the Church. Title 11 of that book contains the official step-by-step rite of exorcism. It is a formal, legalistic procedure. Step 1. The presence, where the exorcist becomes aware of the entity. Step 2. Pretense, where the demon attempts to act as the victim. The exorcist's first job is to break this pretense. In Step 3, the break point, a moment of extreme panic and confusion. Step 4, the voice, a disturbing babble. Step 5, the clash, a tremendous pressure as the exorcist's holy will begins to dominate the spirit. Step 6, expulsion, when the spirit leaves in the name of Jesus. The most important part of this process, Step 2, naming the demon, is the most important first step. For 400 years, every official exorcism has been a case, and every case has generated a report. These reports, detailing the entity, the pretense, the name, and the outcome, are what populate the Vatican's exorcism archives. In the 1980s, Rome's famed exorcist Father Gabriel Amorth began bringing Italian exorcists together to exchange their experiences and best practices. In 1994, the group became the International Association of Exorcists, or AIE. On June 13, 2014, the Vatican's Congregation for Clergy formally recognized the AIE, granting it private juridical personality. Today, the AIE is headquartered in Rome, has over 900 members in 58 countries, and works with the Vatican to set new standards of transparency and training, and published new guidelines for the ministry of exorcism. The Vatican is actively professionalizing and scaling up its exorcism ministry. Why? Because they believe they are in a crisis. In 2018, one Sicilian exorcist told Vatican Radio that alleged cases of demonic possession in Italy had tripled to 500,000 annually. At the same time, Catholic leaders warned no more young priests are willing to learn the rite. But why are these thousands of documented possessions kept so secret? Why are the archives classified? The Church gives several reasons. First, privacy. Exorcism is supposed to be private. The possessed are people who suffer a lot, and the ministry is one of charity, not spectacle. Second, to avoid sensationalism. The media has exploited that vacuum, and the Church fears the public will scoff and say that it's some trick, or dismiss it as an invention of marketing. But there is a third, more troubling reason the archives remain sealed. Failure. On September 6, 2000, Pope John Paul II held his weekly audience. A 19-year-old woman in the crowd became agitated, attracting the Pope's attention. After the audience, the Pope met with the woman for a half-hour, exorcising her. According to Rome's chief exorcist, Father Amorth, the demon was unmoved. Amorth, who had been working with the woman, reported what the demon told him the next day. It sneered at the priest, saying, "Your boss was not able to do anything against me." This is the real secret. The archives are classified not just to protect victims, but to protect the Church's reputation. A documented, failed papal exorcism suggests the Church's ultimate spiritual authority is not so absolute. The archives, therefore, are a confidential database of what works, what doesn't, and which entities have in the past proven more powerful than the Pope. To understand what's in these files, we only need to look at one of the most terrifying cases ever documented, a file that was meant to stay secret, the 1928 exorcism of Anna Eklund. As we covered in our deep dive on that case, Anna Eklund, whose real name was Emma Schmidt, was a 40-something-year-old woman from Iowa. She had shown symptoms of possession since she was 14. In 1928, Father Theophilus Reisinger arranged for her to be brought in absolute secrecy to avoid scandal to a Franciscan convent in Erling, Iowa. What followed was a grueling affair that lasted intermittently for 23 days. The phenomena documented in the case file, a 1935 pamphlet called Begone Satan, are the stuff of nightmares. Anna exhibited incredible physical strength, at one point pinning several nuns to the walls. She spoke in languages unknown to her, levitated from the bed, and vomited nails, tobacco leaves, and other objects. The air was filled with an unbearable stench. The exorcism reached its peak on December 23, 1928, in a moment that confirmed step 2 of the ritual Romanum. The demons were named. Anna convulsed, shrieking the names of the entities possessing her: Beelzebub, Judas Iscariot, her father Jacob, and her aunt Mina. The Eklund case is the perfect archetype of the Vatican's archives. A terrifying event conducted in absolute secrecy to avoid scandal, and formally documented to be studied by future generations of exorcists. Yet the darkest Vatican secret isn't about the demons. It's about bankers, kings, and the all-too-human sins of greed and political suppression. It is one of the most infamous dates in history. Friday, October 13th, 1307. On that day, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, ordered the mass arrest of every Templar in France. The Knights Templar, originally founded as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ to protect pilgrims, had evolved over 2 centuries. They were no longer just a leading military order. They were Europe's first multinational corporation. They were rich and powerful, having amassed substantial lands and pioneering a form of proto-banking that made them formidable financiers. And that was their fatal mistake. King Philip IV was heavily in debt to the Templars due to his wars with the English. He was short of money and eyeing the wealth of the Templars for himself. He saw their independent power and wealth as a state within a state, and a recurring threat to royal power. The arrest on Friday the 13th was not a move of religious piety. It was a state-sanctioned, financially motivated heist. To seize their assets, Philip needed a pretext. He handed them over to the Inquisition for interrogation. Under gruesome tortures, the knights confessed to false charges. The accusations were a pattern, the same ones used against all heretics. They denied God, spitting or urinating on the cross, and ritual homosexuality. But there was one specific charge that has echoed for centuries: the worship of a devilish head called Baphomet. This accusation was a masterpiece of political propaganda. The goat-headed, winged, Sabbatic goat image of Baphomet we know today was an invention of a 19th century occultist. That is not what Philip's inquisitors meant. Medieval Christians believed that Muslims were idolatrous and worshipped Muhammad as a god. Baphomet was a common medieval French misrendering of the Prophet Muhammad. This was the ultimate smear. Philip IV wasn't just accusing the Templars of being heretics, he was accusing the most elite, famous Crusader knights of converting to Islam, of worshipping the fairy tale Muslim idol of their sworn enemy. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was a Frenchman elected under the auspices of King Philip. Philip forced Clement to go along with the suppression. But what about the legendary Templar treasure, the disappearance of their vast wealth? Popular myth speaks of carts loaded with bullion fleeing to the Templar port of La Rochelle, where the fleet set sail with the treasure, never to be seen again. This fuels theories of treasure buried in Scotland or even in America. The historian community, as one source puts it, blows a large raspberry in the direction of all of this. In reality, recorded in the archives is far less romantic and far more cynical. First, the Templars' real wealth was not liquid assets. It was in the form of lands for farming, an enormous pan-European real estate portfolio. Second, the assets were not hidden or stashed. They were stolen in plain sight. The historical record shows exactly where the treasure went. In France, Philip IV incorporated the assets into the royal treasury. What remained of the Templars' enormous fortune was officially transferred by Pope Clement V to the other major military order, the Knights Hospitaller. The lost treasure is a romantic distraction. The treasure was never lost. It was seized by the king and the church. For 700 years, the narrative was that the Templars were heretics, and the Pope, however reluctantly, was forced to act. Then, in September 2001, an Italian paleographer named Barbara Frail was working in the Vatican secret archives. She found a document that had been misfiled for centuries. The Vatican, after confirming its authenticity, finally published it in 2007. This document is the smoking gun of the entire Templar suppression. Dated August 1308, it is the official record of the papal inquiry led by Pope Clement's own cardinals. It records that the Templar leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were questioned. They showed to be repented. They admitted to the charge of denying Christ under pressure during their brutal initiation rituals, but they insisted this was a hazing ritual, not willful heresy. And here is the bombshell. The parchment proves that Pope Clement V, after hearing their confession, absolved the Templar leaders of heresy. He reinstalled them in the Catholic communion and readmitted them to receive the sacraments. This is the secret the Vatican held for 700 years. The Pope knew the Templars were not heretics. He had absolved them in 1308. Yet, 4 years later, in 1312, he issued the papal bull Vax in Excelso, which formally dissolved the order. The bull itself and the Chinon parchment reveal the truth. The Pope's decision was not as a direct condemnation or a theological judgment. He did it for political reasons, to end the conflict with the French king and maintain peace. Pope Clement V sacrificed the entire order, knowing they were innocent of the primary charge, to appease his political master, King Philip IV. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not an act of faith, it was a cold political execution, and the Vatican archives held the receipt. This pattern of suppression, of managing the historical record to protect the institution, continues to this day. It is the most legendary and least understood archive on Earth. For centuries, it was known as the Vatican Secret Archives. In 2019, Pope Francis officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The Vatican, trying for years to debunk the idea that the archives are all that secret, insists this was just correcting a mistranslation of the Latin secretum, which they say simply means private. But this is not a library. It is one of the most important repositories of documents in the world, housed in a fortress-like part of the Vatican. The scale is almost incomprehensible. The archive contains an estimated 85 kilometers or 53 miles of shelving. It holds 35,000 volumes of catalog alone. It is 12 centuries worth of documents, from the 8th century to the 20th. This 2019 rebranding is a modern public relations move. It changed the perception, but it changed nothing about the access. Access is not public. It is open to qualified scholars who must have a 5-year university degree or a clerical license. Researchers are not allowed to browse. They must request documents from indexes that are not public. The rules are mandatory: no pens, no cameras, no bags. And most importantly, documents are only released grouped into pontificates, typically after a 75-year delay. It is a system designed for total institutional control of the historical narrative. In March of 2020, Pope Francis made headlines by unsealing the most controversial collection in the archive, the files of Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958. Pius has long been accused by critics of being a Nazi sympathizer who remained silent during the Holocaust. The Vatican's archivist, upon releasing the files, predicted that the good Pius did was so great that it will dwarf the few shadows. This is not what happened. Researchers like historian David Kurtzer dived into the newly unsealed files. Using the Vatican's own documents, Kurtzer published The Pope at War, a secret history based on these files. He argues the new files are the crucial piece of the puzzle that confirms rather than refutes Pius XII's moral failure. The documents, he claims, detail previously unknown talks and a conciliatory stance toward Hitler and Mussolini, confirming his failure to publicly condemn the Holocaust. The 2020 release, intended by the Vatican to exonerate Pius, has instead provided the raw material for critics to confirm the very complicit silence the Church has been accused of hiding for 80 years. Even today, the patterns of secrecy, finance, and suppression repeat with frightening precision. The pattern from Chapter 2, the Banco Ambrosiano, is mirrored in the Vatican's modern financial scandals. The Church is currently embroiled in a squalid financial scandal over a $200 million deal for a luxury apartment complex in London. The case involves accusations of attempts to disguise the loans on Vatican balance sheets and hide the debt. It is the same playbook, reinforcing the Vatican's image as a shady offshore tax haven. And the pattern from Chapter 1 and Chapter 5, the use of power and secrecy to suppress the truth, finds its darkest modern expression in the global clergy sexual abuse crisis. For decades, the Church's culture of silence was used to cover up the crisis, and the very mechanism of that silence is the same one that guards the archives, the pontifical secret. One German cardinal admitted that under this veil of secrecy, church files about abusers had been destroyed. Bishops moved abusive priests to other parishes, where the abuse continued. The modus operandi is the same. The institutional impulse to use sovereign immunity as they did with Archbishop Marcinkus, to use financial opacity as they did in the London deal, and to use the pontifical secret as they did with the abuse cover-up, it is all part of the same system. It is the same system that put a corpse on trial in 897, that burned the Templars in 1307, and that protected God's banker in 1982. The Vatican Apostolic Archive is not a single vault of conspiracies. It is the documented process of an institution navigating 12 centuries of politics, finance, and faith. It holds the mundane letters from Michelangelo complaining he had not been paid. And it holds the world-changing Henry VIII of England's request for a marriage annulment, and the handwritten transcript of the trial of Galileo for heresy. It is the 12-century-long paper trail of a global superpower. It holds the receipts of its history, the proof of its compromise, its power, and its crimes. 500 years of secrets revealed, but how many more centuries are still locked away?